leaving 1,134 people, half of whom were minors, homeless. And the way it usually works is this. The government comes in the middle of the night, the soldiers come in the middle of the night with their bulldozers. They knock on the door and they say, you have 15 minutes to get everything out of this house that you want to save. And 15 minutes later, they destroy the house. And that is a practice that goes on. We don't hear about it on the news here. I don't know why. And it's taking place regularly and increasing in Israel, in Palestine. But here's the major thing, and the one that's most easy to grasp. Okay, there's the map of the territories, the West Bank. And then, well, let me go back to that. Since 1967, Israel, it's been in control, and in 1967, when Israel got control of the West Bank, they said, what are we going to do now? What are we going to do? And so they consulted their legal counsel for the foreign ministry and said, is it legal for us to move Israelis into the West Bank and have them live there? And Theodore Meron, who was the legal counsel for Israel, studied the issue and said, my conclusion is that civilian settlement in the administered territories contravenes the Fourth Geneva Convention. In other words, no, you can't do it according to international law. You can't just move your people into that land. But look what's happened. That was in 1967, and by 1988, 63,600 people had moved into the West Bank. 1993 was when the Oslo Accords started, and that was supposed to start the peace process. So that took place on September 13th, 1993. But the settlements have continued to grow, so that by 2014 there were 340,000 settlers. That's what they're called. They're very nice apartments. They've moved into the West Bank. Now, and that's not really the whole figure, because there's a whole issue of East Jerusalem, and I won't get into that. But it's more like, now the figures are more like 540,000 Israelis have moved into the West Bank plus East Jerusalem. Just last summer, the Middle East Quartet, which is made up of the United States, the UN, the European Union, and Russia, they issued a statement. They studied this whole issue. And they came to this conclusion: the continuing policy of settlement, construction, and expansion is steadily eroding the viability of the two-state solution. In other words, this isn't helping at all. Israel, you should stop it. Here's what Benjamin Netanyahu said. He said, the report also perpetuates the myth that Israeli construction in the West Bank is an obstacle to peace. So he said, it's a myth. These settlements, over 500,000 people that have moved into the land that we say is going to be a part of the two-state solution, that's no problem at all. So I like to suggest, imagine having a dispute with your neighbor, and this dispute is going on for 50 years, because it dates back to 1967. You're having this land dispute with your neighbor for 50 years, and it hasn't been settled. And so in the meantime, your neighbor is building houses on the property that is being disputed and saying, well, you know, this won't cause any problems at all when it comes to a legal settlement. That's what's happening. If that happened to you and your property, you'd be rather upset. That's why the Palestinians are upset. I like to show some responses, some of the things that people are saying about this problem. And these are not Palestinians, and these are not Americans. These are Jews. So the first one comes from Henry Siegman. He was the president of the American Jewish Congress from 1978 to 1994. He was brought up in Nazi Germany. He escaped as a boy. He describes himself as an ardent Zionist. He's all for Israel, but he says, the Middle East peace process may well be the most spectacular deception in modern diplomatic history. Since the failed Camp David summit of 2000, and actually well before it, Israel's interest in a peace process has been a fiction that has served primarily to provide cover for its systematic confiscation of Palestinian land. That's a pretty amazing statement for someone who says he's an ardent Zionist and a believer in Israel. Aaron Bregman wrote a book entitled Cursed Victory, just published in 2014. He was a soldier in the Lebanon War in 1982, fought for the Israeli Defense Force, rose to the rank of captain. And in this book, he says, Israel was, and in the time of writing is still, a heavy-handed and brutal occupier. Again, a rather amazing evaluation. Here is a rabbi, an American rabbi, Brant Rosen, wrote a book in December 28 after Israel had struck Gaza. He said, I realized how utterly tired I had become, tired of trying to excuse the inexcusable, tired of using torturous, exhausting rationalizations to explain away what I really knew in my heart was sheer and simple oppression. So here's a Jewish rabbi here in the United States saying, I defended Israel, I defended Israel, I defended Israel, until I just couldn't do it anymore. There are other quotes that I could share with you, but I'm going to skip those. Why do we as Americans, and particularly evangelical Christians, support Israel? And I use three adjectives: unquestioningly, uncritically, and unconditionally. Why do we do that? Well, we say we go back to the Bible. So Genesis chapter 12, verse 3 says, I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Words spoken to Abraham. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Doesn't that make it pretty clear? God wants us to bless Israel and to take care of Israel. And so we should give them our unconditional support. And there's a lot more I could say about that. But if you're going to cite that verse, I want to say, let's cite some other Old Testament verses. Exodus 22:1. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Find the same thing in Deuteronomy. Hear the disputes between your people and judge fairly, whether the case is between two Israelites or between an Israelite and a foreigner, maybe a Palestinian. Judge fairly. Numbers. You and the foreigner shall be the same before the Lord. The same laws and regulations will apply both to you and to the foreigner residing among you. All right, if we're going to quote Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, let's quote these other passages as well. Zechariah, the prophets, administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Why aren't we as evangelical Christians quoting those verses as well as Genesis chapter 12, verse 3? So my question is this, and it took me years to come to this conclusion. But why do we give unquestioning, uncritical, and unconditional support to the policies of the modern nation of Israel? One final Bible verse, Proverbs 24. Rescue those being led away to death. Hold back those staggering towards slaughter. If you say, but we knew nothing about this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who guards your life know it? It's really that verse that is my motivation behind this talk. I thought, I do know something about this. I've learned about this. I've seen it. I need to do something about this, because I do believe we have a huge blind spot as evangelical Christians. And so I say to you, now you know about it. And I hope you'll investigate it further and learn more about it, see if what I've said is right. And then I hope you'll do something about it, telling other people. I'm going to let you ask questions. Let me hand out a sheet of recommended resources for you if you want to learn more about this. And let me just mention a few. First of all, there is this handout, which you can pick up, called The Origin of the Problem. Feel free to pick one of these up and read it. It's a lot more about the history. One of the books that's mentioned there is a book called Blood Brothers by Elias Shakur. He was a Christian. He is a Christian. He's a priest now, lives still in Israel. And this is the story of his life when the Israelis forced his people, his family, out of their village. And a lot of people say, this is the first book you should read. It's an easy book to read. It's a story, and it's a moving one. I've got one copy left for $5. My book is over here, called American Evangelicals in Modern Israel, and it's, if you want to buy a copy of that, it's $10. The best book on the subject is not my book. The best book on the subject is this book by an Englishman named Colin Chapman. This is the 5th edition of this book. He wrote it first in 1983, and I remember when I read that book, I just thought, wow, this is so much information. It's gone through 5 editions, and you can order it. I mean, it's available here in the United States. And this is an excellent book. It's also 444 pages. So when I wrote my book, I tried to make something that was perhaps more accessible. So it's not nearly as comprehensive as this one. But, you know, if you don't want to read my book, read this one. This is really good. There's another book that I have mentioned there, Through the Eyes of the Victims by Alex Awad. He's a Christian pastor. He pastored a church he's a Palestinian, pastored a church in East Jerusalem for years. He was also part of Bethlehem Bible College, which is a really fine evangelical school in Bethlehem. And this is the story of his family and what they went through in the 1948 war. And it's got lots of historical information as well. The first part of the book is the story of his mother, really, and then and the rest of it is historical analysis from a Palestinian perspective. And I highly recommend this book. If you want information on what's going on today, if you look under the category Contemporary Israel and Palestine, there's a website for B'Tselem. This is an Israeli organization, not Palestinian, an Israeli organization that documents what's going on in the West Bank and Gaza. It's a human rights organization. They have lots of articles, lots of data. They're very careful in their collection of data. So you can go to their website and learn a great deal. All right, I've done all the talking. Dwight?
What percentage of the Palestinians are Christians?
The percentage of Palestinians who are Christians is very, very small, maybe 1 or 2%, and it is decreasing. By and large, the Christian Palestinians are better educated than the Muslims, and they have more of a possibility to leave and go to another country. And so they have left because they have a possibility of getting out. This has been dragging on for so long, and they have relatives in other countries, and the relatives are saying, why are you putting up with this? Come and join us. One of the reasons that Bethlehem Bible College was started was to preserve a Christian community, an evangelical Christian community within Palestine, because they don't want to give up on their people. And so even though they're a very small minority, they are trying to be faithful to Jesus in Palestine. Another question.
Have you heard of any far more legitimate ways to pursue the problem, or other than the way it is being? I mean,
Well,
if
the United
this isn't an
States,
answer.
the reason that Israel can be so strong is because the United States gives them so much money. And, you know, President Obama was heavily criticized for his relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. But at the end of his administration, he also promised them for the next 10 years far more money. So we had been giving Israel $3.1 billion per year. And now, because of this memorandum of understanding that was signed in the Obama administration, it's now up to $3.8 billion a year. So the United States, to me, is allowing Israel to get away with all kinds of things. So if you remember, in December, there was a UN resolution condemning the Israeli settlements, and the United States, Israel wanted us to exercise our veto in the UN to stop that resolution. And President Obama and the administration, at the first time, the United States has vetoed so many UN resolutions that have been critical of Israel, but this time they abstained, which meant the resolution went through. That was the most critical, that was a good step. But at the same time, you know, we upped our foreign aid to Israel. That was a terrible mistake. It's amazing to me how our congressmen, they get very upset when the Palestinians do something that we don't want them to do. And they're talking about, we should stop all of our aid to the Palestinians. We don't ever say that about Israel. Israel just keeps building settlements, moving people in. We criticize it, and then we give them more money. I don't think that's justice.
How much aid does the United States give to Palestine?
I don't know offhand. It's much, I mean, it's much, much less than what we give to Israel.
What role?
If you went to the Beit Tselem website, I think you could probably find it there. Or if you just did a check, actually there's a congressional, it's a website I go to regularly, congressional reports or congressional research, and they come up about every 6 months. There's a new statement that comes out reflecting the foreign policy both to Israel and to Palestine, and you could find it there.
If you could dictate to Israel the kind of country that you wanted them to be, the kind of just country you wanted them to be, what kind of role, you know, would you want? What kind of Israel would you envision? What kind of Israel do you envision? What does the Bible say that Israel should be?
Well, let me address that politically first, and then theologically. Politically, Israel needs to seriously endorse the two-state solution, which means there's an Israeli state and a Palestinian state. Benjamin Netanyahu says he believes in the two-state solution, but he doesn't do anything to promote it, really. So that would, and there are problems with the two-state solution. There's no question about that. But that really seems to be the best possibility, and Israel is continually working against that. Israel also needs to exercise, needs to stop discriminating against the citizens of Israel that are Palestinians. So that's the political picture. But theologically, we need to understand that Israel is largely a secular nation.
Right.
And so there is still this tremendous need for Jewish evangelism. And we should be praying for the conversion of the Jews. You know, it's not just a political issue, it's far more than that. Huh?
So, first of all, certain places in Israel, like Bethlehem, are not open to Jews. They are run by Palestinians, and Jews can't even go into the city. And secondly, Obama did give the Palestinians military aid. He donated weapons to them.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Obama was aiding the Palestinians when he was in office at some point.
Gave them military aid?
Yeah, he gave them weapons. So I don't know like when that was, but it was in the past years where he was in office. And secondly, historically, the Jews and the Palestinians have always been at conflict. Like, it's been something that's in the Bible and something that's still happening today. It's not like a new thing. It's not that they're just, you know, picking on each other for no reason. Like, the line of the Palestinians came from a sinful act. Like, Abraham had a son that was against God's will. So the entire Palestinian line is from an act that was against God's will. And therefore, like, not a lot of good can come from that, because the act of disobeying God is the reason that the Palestinians are now a nation. And so, like, that conflict has always been there. And I'm not saying that the Palestinians are less than, anything. Like, God says in the Bible throughout that we are supposed to love our neighbors. But this is a conflict that has always been there. And to say that one side is wrong, like, it's not like picking sides, really. Like, I don't think there should be, like, a picking sides, but in the Bible, like, it says that Israel is the Jews' nation. That is the promised land that God has gifted to his people. Like, the Jews are God's people. Like, all throughout the Bible, that's the people that the Bible is centered around. Like, and honestly, like, God's word is, like, what Christians base our lives on, and because that is their land, because God said it. It's not because the Jews are like, well, we don't like the Palestinians, so they can't live here. Like, it's not like that. It's God gave them this gift, and it's not like God won't take care of all of the people around the world, like Americans, Palestinians, Asians, like, he takes care of all of his people, but the Jews specifically, that is their land gifted to them from God because they are his people. So
We're supposed to pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
yeah.
That's Christian unity. So I appreciate what you said.
Thank you.
It's all interesting. It's
Yeah.
challenging, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting to see, like, where the nations are nowadays.
Let me
so.
respond a little bit to what you've said. You're going back to the difference between Ishmael and Isaac, and the conflict that existed between the nation of Esau and Israel. So theologically, we could pursue that if we wanted to. Let me talk about that historically, though. If you talk to Palestinians today, Christian Palestinians, and if you talk to Jews today who trace back to the history, prior to the 20th century, before the Zionist movement started, and there was starting this influx of Jewish people into the land, the Jews and the Muslims who were living there in that land actually got along very well. It's not to say there weren't any conflict, but they really got along very well. So to say that historically the Jews and the Muslims have never gotten along with each other is not true historically. Now that's what the Israeli narrative will tell you, but it's not true. It's the same thing with Prime Minister Netanyahu saying, the real problem for the Christians is the Muslims. And the Christians who are living in the West Bank are saying, wait a minute, that's not our problem. Our problem is not with our Muslim neighbors. Our problem is with the Jewish occupation. So the question is, who are you going to listen to? Are you going to listen to what Benjamin Netanyahu says about what the problem is, or are you going to listen to the people who live there and what the problem is?
Well, personally, I'm just going to read the Bible and look what God said about it. Like, I mean, being a Christian, like, I'm supposed to read the Bible and then look at the world through a biblical lens. And so, like, the historical context of the scriptures is extremely important. And so, like historically, like, the act, like, where their line began was a sinful act. And, like, I do believe that, like, the nation of Israel, like, even historically, they've made mistakes throughout, the entire Bible, like, God gets very frustrated with them at some points, but God always takes care of the Israelites. Like, they'll stray and then they'll come back, like, in the Bible, that's what they did, but, God still promised them that land, and...
Well, let me recommend that you read my book.
Yes.
Because I go into the whole question of the land. And what difference does Jesus make in terms of our understanding of the land? And we don't have time to go into all of that theologically. I just threw up a few verses here. But I really go into the book in much more theological perspective on the land.
Yeah.
And the way we should look at it today. But even if you do think that the land always should be Israel's, they're still required to, according to the Old Testament Torah, they're still required to treat the foreigners with justice.
Of course, yeah.
And why are we as Americans not insisting that they do that? Why do we keep allowing Israel to treat the Palestinians unjustly without any consequences at all?
There are reports, though, that the Palestinian Arabs that live on Jewish land, that the Israeli government treats them better than their own government does. I mean, think about Arab countries. Women have no rights. They're treated like property. They are, you know,
Yes, that's one of the things that
they
Prime
send their
Minister
children to be
Netanyahu,
suicide bombers.
Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to say that regularly. People are treated
it's
better
true.
here in Israel than they are in other Arab countries. Let's acknowledge that
I'd
that
rather
is,
live in Israel than an Arab country.
let's acknowledge that that's true. But that doesn't mean that the way Israel is treating its citizens is right. It may be better than other nations, but that doesn't mean that what they're doing is right.
Do you think they just don't trust them, though? I mean, if they were, you know, if they're hurting innocent civilians in Israel, and wouldn't you have, I mean, they didn't go and bomb them and take their lives. Wouldn't you have some kind of repercussion?
There is a problem, certainly there has been a problem with Palestinian violence.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. But what we don't hear about is the violence that is exerted on the Palestinians by the Israeli Defense Force. So this whole question of home demolition, administrative detention, we don't hear about that
You're
here
saying
in
it
the United
irritates
States.
them and causes more conflict? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, sure, it creates much more conflict. And then when Netanyahu says, oh, you know, I believe in the two-state solution, but he keeps allowing more settlers to move into the land that is supposedly supposed to be part of the two-state solution, the Palestinians don't believe that.
Don't Arabs also occupy Jewish land?
I don't know what you mean by Arabs occupying
You
Jewish
said
land.
that there are Palestinian citizens in Israel. They've allowed them to come in to their part of the land.
years.
Well, they haven't allowed them to come in. That's
Okay.
one of the major sources of the problem, is they pushed 700,000 out in 1948. And they have not allowed them to return. And in 1949, the UN passed a resolution saying, you have to allow these people to come back because that's international law. And Israel has said, nothing doing. We will not allow the people who used to live here to return. But we will allow any Jewish person from any place in the world to come and live here.
So I could
If you
just
need to leave, I've taken too long.
Thanks, Fred.
Please go ahead and leave.
I could just be like not hearing something, whatever. But in my opinion, like I feel like you're kind of pushing all of the blame onto the Israel side. But like I recently just went to Israel. Like I got back in January, and one of the places we visited was Bethlehem. And when we got there, like our tour guide couldn't even go with us, and our bus driver had to park on the outskirts, and then he couldn't even leave the bus the whole time he was there. We had to have a Palestine person come and meet us there, and the Palestine person couldn't, like, if he would have crossed the line, he would have gotten in trouble too. And so what he was like, when we were exchanging, he had to also stay in the bus. And while we were like driving around and stuff, like when we were going over through the checkpoint to get into the area to where we could change buses, that was the hardest checkpoint. Like the Palestinians were very rude to our bus driver, and he was just doing his job. Okay, that's his job. He's a simple man. He's probably one of the sweetest men you'll ever meet. I mean, he was really awesome. And these like people at the checkpoint, they were the Palestinians. They were just being awful to him, and he was just being like really civil to him and everything, or to them. And while we were in Palestine, like the Palestinian people, like, well, we were in there, like, they were nice and stuff, but anytime that we would talk about, like, they'd be like, oh, why are you here? Be like, oh, well, we're touring Israel, and they'd be like, they would find out that we're only into Bethlehem for a couple hours, but we're staying in the Israel side, they like their whole demeanor would just change, and it was like, okay, sorry, we're Americans just touring. It's not really our fault that we picked one side and the other, because we're not, obviously. But and then like it's difficult for me to just be like, oh, it's okay for the Palestinians to completely block the Israelites out from Bethlehem. But it's difficult for me to say that because there's so much of our own history in Bethlehem also. And so I don't think, like, I feel like you're just putting a lot of the blame completely on the Israelites when also the Palestine people are also part of the problem. I mean, they've literally blocked out the Israelites from history, like from our own history. Like the Israelites can't even come into Bethlehem at all. And there are several other places that they cannot go. And it's like, okay, this is their country too. Like, why can't, like, I don't know, it's just difficult for me to just completely put all of this blame on the Israelites when they're not really being treated fairly either.
Now, let me just respond. The Israelis are not allowed to go into Bethlehem because that's part of Area A, which is supposed to be under the security and the civilian government of the Palestinian Authority. And there are signs up that say no Israeli can come into this territory. Those are signs that are put up by the Israeli government. It's the Israeli government that says no Israeli can pass this point and go into Area A. So it's not the Palestinians who are doing that.
Why? Why wouldn't they want them to go in Jerusalem or Bethlehem?
Why wouldn't the Israelis want them to go into that? Because they want to, that's Area A, which is supposed to be under the complete control of the Palestinian Authority. So that's why they have that sign up there. And it gives the impression that Israel has complete hands-off of Area A. Although Israeli soldiers will go into Area A anytime they think that they need to.
Who made the divide? Like, who
That was
divided
the
them?
Oslo Accord in 1993.
Which, like, did the Jews or the Palestinians have a hand in who decided where the divide would be?
Yeah, it was an agreement.